Thank you all so much. So, I am a storyteller. But before you put me into a rocking chair and wrap me up in an afghan and have me reading picture books to 4-year-olds, I should tell you that's not the kind of storytelling I do. I tell the gritty grown up stories of life to help inspire people to survive the gritty grown up stuff of life. Things like job loss, cancer, divorce, relocation, death of a spouse, especially that last one, death of a spouse, because you see, I am also a widow. I represent the over 700,000 women who will be widowed in the United States this year, according to the U.S. Department of Census. And our average age when we are widowed is only 57. So I was just 2 years ahead of the curve at age 55. And after my husband died, I harnessed the power of my personal narrative, my life story, to help me survive all of the transitions that came to me after his death. And now I help other women who are suffering from grief and loss reclaim their lives through my A Widow's Tale project. We harness the power of their personal stories to help them rebuild their lives after grief. And when we share our stories in retreat, we create a sacred community where everyone's story is honored and everyone's voice is heard. Now, I first learned about the power of claiming your personal narrative from my mother, although I didn't know it at the time. My mother was known in our community for two things. She was an amazing pianist and organist, and she was a 43-year breast cancer survivor. And my mother always blamed her cancer, which was first diagnosed when she was 39 and finally took her life when she was 83, on having given up what she loved in order to become a pastor's wife. Music was my mother's world. But when she married my dad, the church thought that it would be a conflict of interest for her to be the organist where he was the pastor. And so Mother gave up performing her music. And she always believed that when she betrayed her own joy, when she gave up performing, when she folded up her music and stuffed it down into her breast, that it became cancerous. Now, breast cancer treatment in the 1950s was an ugly thing. It still is. But then there were no lumpectomies or chemo or radiation. Instead, in one surgery after another, the doctors carved away the left-hand side of my mother's body. And then when they didn't get it all, they sent her home to die. But Mother didn't die. She outlived her surgeon by 20 years. What she did was what all people who are dying do. She reviewed her life story. And in it, she realized that she had given up that which gave her life. She had given up her music. And so as soon as she was able, she began to practice the piano and the organ again. And then, in nothing short of a heavenly joke, she became the organist for the church on the other side of town, the one whose service started an hour before my dad's. And every Sunday, she would play the organ for them. Then she would kick off her organ shoes. Then she'd dash back across town, slide into the front pew, and beam at the parishioners while my father preached. My mother's story saved her life. Story is that powerful. Why? Well, it's our oldest communication medium. I mean, the hunter-gatherers were telling each other stories about the big one that got away over 200,000 years ago. We've been telling stories so long that we are actually hardwired to receive and to tell story. Neuroscientists at Princeton University have actually watched the brains of their test subjects light up when they listen to a story. It turns out that listening to a story lights up more regions of your brain than sex. What they discovered was that the sensory regions of your brain that are responsible for perceiving information about sound, sight, smell, taste, and touch all light up when you hear a story. But what's really interesting is that the listener's brains light up in the same places at the same time as the storyteller's brain. And this makes complete sense to me because a story is not words. Now, a story has words, but a story is not words. A story is images that I see, that I share with you. For instance, if I were to tell you a story about going to a ball game and eating a foot-long hot dog with mustard and chili, onions, and relish, you might just see chili and mustard on my fingers. Why? Because the story created an image of the hot dog in your mind. Now, because story harnesses all of our sensory awareness, it influences us in very subtle but powerful ways. And there are two kinds of stories. There's the kind of story that wants to help you, and there are the ones that don't. So how do you tell the difference? You need to ask yourself if the story cares about you or not. If it has your best interest at heart, it's probably a story that can help you. And if it doesn't, it can't. Now, the first story, the kind that can help you, it's the story that lives deep inside of you. It's your own personal narrative. And it remembers more about you than your best friend. It remembers all of your successes and failures. It remembers your strengths and weaknesses, and it remembers what gives you joy. Remember my mother's story? When you access this story, it can help you survive the big stuff of life because it remembers all of your other successes. It remembers how you survived all those other transitions. Now, the other kind of story, the one that can't help you, it comes from outside of you, and it is not your truth. Some of these stories come to us from the advertising world. Advertisers have known about the power of storytelling for a very long time. And they tell you stories primarily with images and music of how rich and powerful, seductive and attractive you can be if you just drive the right car, pop the right pill, use the right cell phone to order that pizza that pretty well ensures that you will never fit into those designer jeans. These stories just want to sell you something. They can't help you. Now, the media are also storytellers. And because of the way that story harnesses all of our sensory awareness, they can create carefully crafted alternate realities. For instance, do you remember how many times you watched the towers fall after 9/11? You couldn't turn on a TV for days without watching the Twin Towers fall. We watched the Twin Towers fall so many times that finally pediatricians begged the media to stop showing the images. Because you see, every time our children saw the Twin Towers fall, they thought it was happening again and again. Our children thought that the whole world was blowing up. And speaking of children and stories, the most dangerous stories that come from outside of us are the ones when we were just little people. We internalized them when we were too young to recognize that they were not our truth. And these stories, they tell us that we can't, we shouldn't, we'll never be good enough because we're too ugly or stupid or lazy or weak. These stories tell us that we deserve that beating, or that sex between a child and a grown-up is perfectly normal, but don't you dare tell anybody about it. These kinds of stories, they keep us feeling small and weak. If you don't remember anything else I've said tonight, please remember that if a story doesn't love you, it is not your truth. It cannot help you. And those stories that do not have your best interest at heart, let them go. because one way or the other, sooner or later, those stories will hurt you. You see, the gritty grown-up stuff of life, it happens all the time. Things like cancer and divorce and job loss and death of a spouse. And when the gritty grown-up stuff happens to you, you don't need a story that tells you to buy something. You don't need a story that tells you you're weak and small. You see, when the big stuff happens, you're going to feel weak and small anyway. No, you're going to need a story that stands by you like your best friend. You're going to need a story that remembers and honors the real you. I never knew the power of this kind of story until I became a widow. I was married for 23 years. My husband, Perrin, was a tall, handsome Southern gentleman, a Rhett Butler kind of a guy. I was his Scarlet. And he was an extreme athlete. He did not have an ounce of body fat on his body. One New Year's Day, he went for a typical 5-mile run. But at 11 o'clock that night, I awoke to a strange strangling noise. He was having a massive stroke. He had a 5.5-inch clot in his left carotid artery. It went from his shoulder to above his ear. And I went from lover and partner to caregiver in the blink of an eye. And then, 10 months later, after all the assurances from the medical community that it would never happen again, it was just a fluke, it happened again. Only this time, he was on enough blood thinner to drop an elephant, and he didn't survive it. And I went from wife to widow in the space of a breath. And my whole world turned upside down. I didn't know what to do. We had a 16-year-old son. Death doesn't come with a handbook. And when someone you love dies, your brains fall out. I either didn't know what to do or I was afraid I couldn't do it. The only thing I knew to do was to reach deep inside myself and grab onto my story. And when I did, my story wrapped its arms around me, and I rode my story like a bat out of hell. And my story saved me. When I wondered if I would survive widowhood, my story showed me images of myself moving across the country when I was just 21, by myself. My story showed me other images of grief and loss. It reminded me that I had been divorced and that I had rebuilt my life without a man once before. And my story showed me images of what brought me joy. It reminded me of who I was. My story not only healed me, it connected me with my deepest, most authentic and vital self. It even showed me what I liked to do in high school. So now, in the few minutes we have left, I want to show you how to harness your story. So I want everybody to just take in a deep breath. Let it out very slowly through your mouth. And then I want you to take in another breath and just close your eyes. And as you let your breath out very slowly through your mouth, I want you to see your high school. See the outside of your high school. Now remember who you were in high school. Maybe you played on the football team, or maybe you were a cheerleader. Maybe you were the photographer for the school newspaper. Maybe you were the class clown. Maybe you played in the marching band, or you were the top scholar. See yourself in that glory time of high school, that time when you had the world by a tail. And just sit with that memory of being young and energetic. And now I invite you to let your breath out very slowly through your mouth and to open your eyes. You just harnessed your story. And when big change like divorce or job loss or cancer or relocation or death of a spouse comes to you, you can harness the power of your story because it remembers everything about you and it wants to help you survive. So grab onto your story and let it walk you through the big transformations that may come to you. Just remember that there are two kinds of stories. The one that wants to help you, the one that's on the inside of you, and the ones that come from the outside of you that do not have your best interest at heart.